Private debt is where the calamities have come from. It's the thing that influences economic outcomes the most. And if you look at that, private sector debt in the United States has gone from about 35% of GDP in 1945, exiting World War II, to 160% today. So it's almost quintupled in that period.
You're listening to Kerry Lutz's Financial Survival Network, where you get valuable information you just can't find anywhere else. To thrive in today's trying times, you need the Financial Survival Network, now more than ever. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and get your free newsletter and gift. Financial Survival Network, now more than ever.
Welcome. You are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm your host, Kerry Lutz. Well, hey, you look at the debt, maybe your own personal debt, maybe others, the country, companies, corporations around the globe, municipalities, you name it. Everybody's in hock up to their eyeballs. No one seems to care about it. We've got a debt-fueled economy. We got a debt-based currency. And basically, we no longer have capitalism. We have creditism. And what can go wrong? What can possibly go wrong? Well, we're going to talk to Richard Vig. Richard, you've done a lot. You've venture capitalist, author, Secretary of Banking and Securities in the great state, or once great state, of Pennsylvania. And now you've got a book out called The Paradox of Debt. What is the paradox of debt?
Well, thank you so much for having me. Our book, The Paradox of Debt, is really about how debt has a dual nature. It is both a creator and a destroyer. You can't have economic growth without debt, and yet debt can get us in a lot of trouble. Witness the 2008 global financial crisis.
It's funny when you talk about that. You make me think of Robert Kiyosaki, and he says there's good debt and there's bad debt. Good debt is money you borrow that helps you make more money and, create jobs, expand your company. Bad debt is debt that is taken on to further consumption of things like flat screen TVs. He even sees your own home as a consumer item. What's your take on it? What's good debt? What's bad debt?
Well, sometimes the lines are fuzzy, but I think as relates to personal debt, his guidelines seem to me to be very useful. If you can buy a home at a fair value, not in a loan, for example, and you don't over leverage that loan, it can be a way to create wealth for you over time. If you borrow, as he says, for the flat screen TV or for vacation, that's the kind of thing that can and does regularly get folks into trouble.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're in different cycles in your life, right? When you're young, you get married, you don't have kids, you're kind of like or you're about to have kids, you're in the acquiring phase of your life. Then later on, the kids are gone. They're through with college, and you're in the you're not in the acquisition phase of life anymore. You're more just experiential kind of phase, enjoying your life. Is sometimes debt justified to have a better life, to have more fun in the present at the expense of the future?
Well, we kind of have a big development over the last decade or two on that very issue, and that has been the massive increase in student debt. Going back about a little over 10 years, total student debt in the economy was $250 billion. Today, it's close to $1.8 trillion. And that has been a function of several things, among which are the for-profit colleges that have degrees or diplomas of questionable value. And as a result, we have, something on the order of 43 million Americans that have student debt. And it's not just 20 and 30-year-olds, it's 60 and 70-year-olds. And that has changed the dynamic that you're talking about somewhat. You see folks leaving college with far more debt as a percent of their income. That used to be true. You see a delay in household formation buying homes, getting married, having kids. And you have folks, later in life that have more debt, particularly as it relates to student debt, than they did a generation ago. So it's skewing all of those things that used to be true in an adverse way.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. And, student loan debt has not, the idea was to increase the number of people getting college educations. In theory, that's a good thing, right? But in reality, all it's done is line the pockets of the educational industrial complex, right?
Well, one thing's for sure true is that tuition in real terms has gone up significantly, and that's part of the equation. We just have folks incurring more debt early in their life.
Yeah, so, but I just had a guest on the other day. You don't have to really take on all that debt. Yeah, if you're going into STEM and there's a reason why you need to go to an Ivy League college or one of these high-cost colleges, yes, definitely. But maybe our values as a society are a little skewed in that we're reaching for the, the Mercedes-Benz of education when a little, a Hyundai would be adequate.
Well, and you have another phenomenon. I think that's true, but we have another phenomenon as well, and that has been the kind of the bias towards a liberal arts education as opposed to more, functional education. And there was a haunting moment I had. I did a tour of the country a couple of years ago when I went around to 15 different states, talked to a lot of folks, in a disciplined way about these issues. And there was a gentleman there that got his undergraduate degree in liberal arts, had gotten a master's in, this was in Charleston, South Carolina, got a master's degree in music, was now a teacher of music at several of the area colleges, which he was doing without healthcare benefits, because, tenure is something that's universities shy away from as much as possible. So he was supplementing his income with gigs as a musician around town. So here he is in his 40s. He's still got over $100,000 in debt. His brother-in-law, as he reported to me, was a plumber, making well over $100,000 a year with generous benefits and zero student debt. And he looked at me and he said, why didn't somebody tell me when I was 18 years old? So you have a bias, I think, up and down the line that might not be the most productive.
Yeah. So getting back to our debt paradox here, what are we supposed to do?
Well, it is a paradox. We look at both government debt and private debt in this book, and we look at it for the 7 largest countries in the world. There's 200 countries in the world, but 7 of them together constitute 2/3 of the world's GDP. So if you look at just those 7, you really have, I think, a fairly comprehensive understanding of the world. And within those, private sector debt is a much larger phenomenon than public debts. In the U.S., as an example, private sector debt is about 40 trillion, government debt's about 30 trillion. So private debt is where the calamities have come from. It's the thing that influences economic outcomes the most. And if you look at that, private sector debt in the United States has gone from about 35% of GDP in 1945, exiting World War II, to 160% today. So it's almost quintupled in that period. Folks are just lugging around a lot more debt. And, we need several things on the private debt side. One of them is what you've already mentioned, which is just more discipline around the issue. Second, I think we need to find more creative ways to let folks get out of their debt in a fair but more straightforward way. And then another thing we need to do is we need to be vigilant for rapid buildups in unproductive debt, as happened, in 2002 to 2007. It brought our great financial crisis. In 2002, mortgage debt was $5 trillion. By the time you get to 2007, it's $10 trillion. Mm-hmm. It's doubled in a little over 4.5 years. That's millions of loans being made to folks with no income, no jobs, no assets, or very little of the above. It's millions of homes that sat empty. We had a global financial crisis, and nobody, in the mainstream economics profession even noticed and gave us any forewarning of that. So, we need reform up and down the line.
Yeah, that's for sure. And, things like taking out a student loan, which could adversely impact a young kid, basically a child at 17, 18, could ruin their lives, make them into a total debt slave. There's no counseling for this. Nobody explains to this kid, not that they would necessarily understand it anyway, because it's complicated and they don't have the life experience, but nobody explains to the kid what they're in for this stuff. It's really, you really do a disservice to this, to people in this situation,
Yeah, there's very little financial education. We actually, when I was banking secretary in Pennsylvania, we actually had a department that provided this training. We provided a lot of training to students, to the elderly, to, the military, frankly, to incarcerated individuals about to reenter the workforce. And we did a lot, and all told, it was just a drop in the bucket. The lack of knowledge around these subjects is so vast.
Yeah, I mean, you and I, being professionals, having dealt with debt, mortgages, whatever, our whole lives, we get it. But, when a person my age, my advanced age, goes to take out a reverse mortgage, what happens? You have to take like an 8-hour course on all the ins and outs and what you're going to be paying and what can happen in your estate and all that stuff. And to me, it just seems like there should be mandatory education, just like when we were growing up, cigarettes didn't have a warning on the label on the side. Now they got warning labels all over. Maybe every loan that you take out and every debt that you incur should come with a warning label.
I was unaware of what you just said about the reverse mortgage. That's actually very encouraging to hear that, and sounds like a terrific idea that perhaps is saving a lot of senior citizens from calamity.
Yeah. Well, you learn that, right? There's no free lunches, right? Did we learn that in economics? Right? There's no such thing as a free lunch.
It's not what the folks at the lottery would have to believe.
Yeah. Well, you got to be in it to win it, right?
Yeah.
You got to be in it to win it. But seriously, we could just do so much better than we're doing here. That's my gripe is it's unnecessary. The issues that we're going through here, they're all avoidable and fixable. And maybe that's the crux of your book.
Yeah. We also spend an area, and we spend time in an area, which is far more controversial. And really that's, in and around the subject of government debt and also around inequality. And to give you a sense of that, in the pandemic, when the government spends money, it doesn't disappear. It effectively goes into household checking accounts. So in the very period from roughly 1981 to the present, total debt in our economy has grown from 125% to 260% of GDP. It's just been massive growth. But in that exact same period, household net worth, that's assets minus liabilities, has grown an even greater amount, from 350% of GDP to almost 600% of GDP. So the growth in debt has created an increase in household wealth. And in the 3 years of the pandemic, we saw this dramatically. $8 trillion increase in government debt in a 3-year period caused a $30 trillion increase in household wealth. So the phenomenon of debt bringing wealth is not one that's well understood. But as we go to great lengths to show, almost all of that increase in wealth goes to the top 1% or 10% or however you want to slice it, the wealthiest people in the economy. So the 30 trillion in wealth that was created in the 3-year period of the pandemic, which was, by the way, the greatest period of wealth creation in economic history in the United States as best we can measure. And probably 23 trillion of that 30 trillion went to the top 10%. So it actually increased inequality to a greater degree than we really have seen probably ever, certainly in a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so was it really wealth creation that took place, though, during the pandemic, or was it inflation-induced wealth creation?
Well, you can break it down and you can come to your own conclusions. But, basically, the $8 trillion that the government spent ends up in household checking accounts. And so that much is real. So, and then the remaining 22 trillion, is roughly divided between the increase in the value of real estate and then the increase in the value of the stock market. And as we know, those go up and down. But if we look at the trend over an extended period, in this case, most of that occurred in a 60 to 65 year period starting, a 40 to 45 year period starting in 1980. It's gone up and down, but over time, the trend is always up over time. Like I said, household net worth was, 350% of GDP in 1980, and today it's 600% of GDP.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I'll buy there's a wealth effect, but that wealth could be very fleeting. It's just like when you take out a student loan, it's your liability, but it's the government's asset in theory. But now
you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And the important principle there is you don't have assets without liabilities. So, if somebody's wealth is gaining over here, that means somebody is becoming more indebted over there. And that's the increase in inequality that we talk about. So, what you say is undoubtedly true, but it kind of feeds into the divisions in society that we've been saying.
Yeah. So,
and that's not just true in the U.S., by the way. That's true in every country.
So debt increases income inequality, right? Because inflation does.
Income and net worth inequality.
Yeah. Inflation certainly does, because the people holding the assets make all the money, right?
That's right.
So
they're the net beneficiaries.
All right. So interesting phenomena, and it's kind of a conundrum for our policymakers, and it also fits into demographics too, because we've got a pending demographic disaster in the country, because people aren't having kids, they aren't getting married, right?
Yeah, it's something that most folks don't notice, and it's happening in the United States, but it's happening in a much more pronounced way in places like China, in Germany, and Spain, and Japan. Where our demographic picture isn't that great, but it's a lot better than most of the rest of the world. But anywhere you look, the deceleration in population growth is creating all sorts of problems that are, frankly, very interesting. I just looked at this number the other day. The average age, the median age in the U.S. in 1980 was 30. Today, the median age is 39.
That's substantial.
We're getting old.
Yeah, I feel it. I feel even older now that you said it.
Me too.
But it's a legitimate problem for which the government has no, in Russia, they were paying people to get married and have kids. I don't think that's really a long-term solution.
And it made no difference.
Yeah. In the end, they just blew it on vodka, I guess.
Right.
But
and there's an aspect of that where it becomes unrecoverable. I remember looking at the data in Spain and looking for women. So, you kind of have to look at women because they're the ones that had the kids. And the number of women in Spain that were aged 0 to 5 was 30% lower than the number of women aged 30 to 35.
Wow.
Well, there's kind of no way to recover from that, unless those little 3-year-olds are going to be willing to have 10 or 15 kids when they get to the age. It's an irreversible phenomenon. So I think the U.S. is still in a position where we can sustain a population growth. That's not true in some countries.
Yeah, very, very, very much the case. Well, we covered a lot of issues here. Really appreciate your coming on with us, sharing your book, Richard. Again, tell us the book, where we find it, wherever fine books used to be sold, I assume.
Absolutely. It's Paradox of Debt, and you can find it on Barnes & Noble and Amazon. We have our own website, which is paradoxically.com. I'm so grateful to be able to come on the show.
Hey, and we're very grateful to have you, Richard. If you got a question for Richard or myself, shoot me an email, kl@kerrylutz.com. The link to his site is in the show notes to this interview on financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Make sure you go sign up for your free newsletter. Richard, sure we'll have you on again. Appreciate you stopping by.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Kerry Lutz's Financial Survival Network, your solution to today's trying times. For the latest, go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Financial Survival Network, now more than ever.